December 7, 1941. Pearl Harbor is burning from one end to the other, and out in the middle of it, one ship is moving. She is the oldest battleship in that harbor. Commissioned in 1916. 583 feet of steel the Navy already thought of as half a relic. This morning she is moored alone at the north end of Battleship Row, astern of the Arizona. And of the 8 battleships trapped in that harbor, she is the only one to raise steam, cast off her lines, and stand for the open sea while the bombs are still coming down. Her name is Nevada. Everyone remembers the ships that sank at Pearl Harbor. Almost nobody remembers the one that got underway and fought back, and then spent the next 7 years refusing to die. Because the Japanese were not the last people who would try to sink her. Her own Navy would try too, with an atomic bomb. Keep that in your mind. To understand what she did, you have to understand what she was. By 1941, the battleship was already being quietly overtaken by the aircraft carrier, and Nevada was old even among battleships. She had fought in no great battle. She had spent the 1930s as one gray hull among many, a ship the fleet's planners were starting to file under obsolete. That judgment was not foolish. Her guns were a generation old, and her armor had been designed for a kind of war that was ending. The judgment was also about to look very small. Here is what the Japanese understood better than almost anyone alive that year. They had the finest naval air arm afloat, the best carrier pilots, the best aerial torpedo in the world, and a plan of real elegance. 6 carriers, hundreds of aircraft, one quiet Sunday morning. They came to erase the American battle line at its moorings and to trap whatever survived inside the harbor. If they could sink one heavy ship in the narrow channel, they could cork the entire Pacific Fleet in its own base for months. For most of Battleship Row, the plan worked. Arizona was gone in the first half hour, more than 1,100 men with her. Oklahoma rolled over at her berth. West Virginia settled into the mud. She was not the newest ship on that row. She was not the biggest. She was the oldest, and she had just lit a second boiler. Nevada that morning was a ship full of boys. The average age of her crew was 19 and a half. Farm kids, mechanics, reservists, a mess of ordinary young Americans on an old ship on a slow Sunday. Her captain was ashore. So were a good many of her officers. The man who would end up taking her to sea was Lieutenant Commander Francis Thomas, a reserve officer, the senior man left aboard. And the reason she could move at all came down to a small decision made by a junior officer of the deck named Joseph Taussig. Taussig had lit that second boiler ahead of schedule. On any ordinary morning, that meant nothing. On this one, it cut the time to get underway from 2 hours to about 40 minutes. There was one more piece of luck, and you should hold on to it. In the days before the attack, her crew had been swapping out the projectiles in her forward magazines. The heavy shells were off the ship. The powder was not yet fully back aboard. That morning, her forward magazines were nearly empty. Remember that. 60 of the men who took her to sea that morning never came home. A like keeps their names in front of a few more people. It costs nothing, and it matters more than it should. 0755. The first Japanese aircraft came in over the harbor, and the world came apart. Aboard Nevada, that young ensign sounded the alarm and put a single sentence out over the ship's speakers. All hands to general quarters. This is no drill. Her gunners were firing within minutes, faster than almost any ship on the row. A Japanese torpedo plane bored in low off her port side, and her gunners caught it and knocked it down into the water about 100 yards off her quarter. But the torpedo was already in the water. It hit her forward, low, near the waterline. The blast tore her hull open, flooded her port compartments, and gave her a list. The old ship shrugged, counter-flooded, and came back upright. And then her officers did the thing no one else in that harbor did. They got her underway. 0840. Her log reads, "Underway on various courses, conforming to the channel, standing out of harbor." Stand on that shore for a moment and watch her go. A wounded battleship, torn open forward, backing off her berth and swinging her head down the channel, through the smoke, past the burning wreck of the Arizona, while men on the shore and on the decks of dying ships stood and watched a single ship fight her way toward the sea. To the pilots of the second wave, she was the prize. The one heavy ship still moving. If they could put her on the bottom of that channel, they could seal the harbor. So they came for her. Dozens of dive bombers, rolling in on one wounded battleship. The bombs walked across her, one near the forward turret, one at the base of her stack, two more on the forward deck, where fire broke out near the gasoline stowage. Working that forward deck, casting off lines and then fighting to let go the anchors, was the ship's chief boatswain, a career sailor named Edwin Hill. He had already swum back to her once that morning after casting off her lines under fire. Now the bombs came down around him, and they killed him where he stood. And here the men conning her had a hard choice. They could try to force the narrow channel to open water and risk going down inside it, which was exactly what the Japanese wanted, a sunk battleship plugging the harbor. Or they could put her aground somewhere she would block nothing. A signal came from the harbor. Do not try for the sea. They chose the mud. They ran her nose gently into the shallows off Hospital Point, a harbor tug nudging at her flank, and let her settle. To the pilot rolling in on her now, she looked finished. Beached, burning, a stationary target sitting over her own magazines. A sure kill. Now watch what did not happen. Bombs had struck her forward, right over the magazines. On any other morning, with the shells and the powder stowed where they belonged, that is the moment an old battleship becomes a fireball, the way the Arizona had an hour before. But her forward magazines were nearly empty. The one blow that should have finished her had nothing left to set off. Below, in the forward dynamo room, a machinist named Donald Ross kept her power alive through smoke and steam and heat until he was blinded and knocked out cold, came to, and went back in. He would receive the Medal of Honor. So would Edwin Hill for the last thing he ever did. When the smoke cleared, she was aground and burning, and still flying her flag. She had taken a torpedo and at least 6 bombs. 60 of her crew lay dead. It was not enough. If your father or your grandfather served on a battleship in the Pacific or off Normandy, put his name, his ship, and his hometown in the comments. That is how the memory holds. So why did she live when the ships around her died? Part of it was luck, the empty magazines, the plane her gunners knocked down. But most of it was not luck. It was design, and it was doctrine. Nevada had been built on a principle the Americans pushed further than anyone, called all-or-nothing armor. Pile the heavy steel over the vital spaces, the magazines and the engines, and leave the ends lightly protected. It made her hard to kill in the exact places that kill a battleship. Around that armor was an American obsession the Japanese never matched: damage control. Trained crews, drilled without mercy, who fought fire and flooding as a craft in its own right. And behind all of it stood the thing that truly separated the two navies. Not courage. The Japanese had courage to spare. It was industry. The United States could haul a wrecked battleship out of the mud, tow her home, and send her back to sea better than she was built. That is what they did. She was refloated in February of 1942, sent to Puget Sound, and rebuilt into a modern ship with new anti-aircraft guns, new fire control, and new radar. And here is the number this whole story turns on. Before her own Navy could put this one old battleship down for good, she would survive Pearl Harbor, 5 amphibious invasions, and 2 atomic bombs. Read that again. The old battleship went back to war, and she did not go quietly. In May of 1943, she shelled the Japanese off Attu in the Aleutians. A year later, on June 6, 1944, she stood off Utah Beach at Normandy, the only battleship at that landing that had also been at Pearl Harbor, and she put 337 rounds of 14-inch shell into the German defenses. She dueled the shore guns at Cherbourg, straddled again and again, and never once hit. She bombarded southern France. She shelled Iwo Jima. Off Okinawa in the spring of 1945, a kamikaze drove a diving aircraft into her, killed 11 of her men, and she kept firing. Read that list again. Attu, Normandy, southern France, Iwo Jima, Okinawa. 5 invasions on 2 sides of the world by a ship her own service had thought was finished before the war even began. Then the war ended, and the Navy decided she was too old to keep. That judgment was fair. She was 30 years old. But instead of a quiet scrapping, they chose her for something else. In 1946, they towed her out to Bikini Atoll, painted her a bright red-orange from stem to stern, and anchored her at the dead center of the first post-war atomic test. She was the bullseye, the aiming point for an atomic bomb dropped from a B-29. The bomb missed. It fell some 2,000 feet off the mark, and the orange battleship at the center of it was still floating when the cloud lifted. So they set off a second atomic bomb, this one underwater, right beside her. She lived through that too. An atomic bomb. It was not enough. So how do you finally sink a ship like this? In the summer of 1948, the Navy found out. They towed her 65 miles off Pearl Harbor and used her for target practice. A modern battleship and her cruisers hammered her with gunfire. Destroyers poured shells into her. It went on for the better part of 4 days, and still she would not go under. In the end, it took an aircraft and an aerial torpedo into her side to send the old ship down. Here is the whole ledger, and it should be said plainly. It took her own Navy 4 days of gunfire and a torpedo to do what the Japanese and 2 atomic bombs could not. Count the cost with the record. 60 of her men died getting her underway that first morning. She was painted orange and spent as a nuclear test animal by the country she had served. One of her sailors, who rowed her from Normandy to Okinawa, said she should have been kept in the water beside the Missouri. Instead, she was expended. Everything the enemy threw at her, and everything the atom threw at her, it was not enough. In the end, only her own side could do it, and it was the hardest thing they ever had to sink. For 70 years, nobody knew exactly where she lay. Then, in 2020, searchers found her, resting upside down under more than 15,000 feet of black water. On her stern, still faintly readable, the number 36. The oldest battleship at Pearl Harbor was the only one that moved, and she was the last one they could kill. Subscribe if you want the next one. More ships, more crews, more names that were never meant to be forgotten.